the ease of making certain models and continents is an investment.
Yeah.
It's genetics.
Yeah. And there's, well, I have heard you studies on linguistics in complexity, and these are related that there are emotional components as well. So this.
So many of you know her, have seen her, have chatted with her, but let me give you a brief background on what she did in the past, what she's going to talk to you about, present to you. So she started at the University of Malta and did an undergrad degree over there, and then moved to University College London for her master's and completed her PhD there on a thesis titled How the Relationship Between Subduction and Mantle Dynamics Shapes Slab Evolution at Upper Lower Mantle Depth. So you can see already the overlap to her talk. So this will be surrounding subduction mechanisms and subduction, how subduction will be evolving and all that. So she's the expert on that, not me. So after that, she started a professional career, being a visiting research scholar at the University of California in Los Angeles, then became a postdoc at Texas at Austin, so University of Texas, and then ended up here with us, and hope she'll stay with us for a while, if not for a much longer period. And she's incredibly active in public outreach. She's very much engaged in her geodynamics community. So there's lots of energy going in. And I think that energy will now be projected onto us. Welcome, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So thank you everyone for showing up today. And thank you, Paul, for that lovely introduction. As Paul mentioned, today we will be talking about subduction. And subduction is something which is very, very common on Earth. And everywhere you look, you find evidence of present-day subduction, ongoing subduction, but also evidence of paleo subduction. Subduction is also one of the main drivers that shape the Earth to look the way it does today. And it is also one of the main ingredients why our planet can host and sustain life. Despite its central role and despite the fact that it's everywhere, we really struggle to understand this process. It's very, very complex, and it is also very heterogeneous. And you can see some of that heterogeneity in the cartoon that I have on my opening slide, showing the different slab morphologies we find within the mantle. We can also see some of that heterogeneity in this map of the major subduction zones on Earth by Hayes and co-authors from 2018, which essentially shows the depth of different slabs across the Earth's major subduction zones. And we can see that, for instance, here, for the Mexican slab, we have a very shallow dipping slab. Whereas if we had to look at the Tonga, for instance, we can see that this is a very steeply dipping slab shown here in these purple and bluish colors. Okay, but if you had to quickly eyeball this map, you can very broadly classify these subduction zones into three main categories. Flat slab regions, where the subducting plate underlies directly the overriding continental lithosphere. On the other end of the spectrum, we have very steeply dipping slabs, which sink directly into the mantle. And between these two end members, we have intermediate slabs. Now, this heterogeneity is not something that occurs only between different subduction zones. If you had to look at this figure, you can perhaps already start to pick out that some of this variability in subduction style also occurs within the same subduction zone. And a great example of that is the South American margin, where we have flat slab segments here in Peru and Chile, right next to steeply dipping slabs along the same trench. This heterogeneity in space is not only something that we can find across different subduction zones and across the same trench segment, but we also see it in time. And a great example of that is the northwestern margin of the United States, where we can see we have a lot of uplift and a lot of deformation related to the Laramide orogeny and flat slab, which occurred at around 60 million years ago. So during this time, we had a steeply dipping slab, which changed its angle to a transient flat slab. And this obviously has geochemical implications because we have shutdown of volcanism, the migration of the volcanic front further inland, but we also have considerable deformation within the overriding plate. And this is what created the Basin and Range, for instance, and the Colorado Plateau. Eventually, the flat slab episode terminates, and we have steepening of the slab once again. And yet, despite the fact that the flat slab is now removed, we still see the remnant deformation within the continental margin. So given this variability in subduction styles, we ask ourselves, what is the major controlling factor? Why do we have this variability in space and time, and sometimes even at the same subduction zone? And the way people have thought about this in the past is generally to think of the subducting slab. So if you have subducting material, which is variable in either buoyancy or age or thickness, then you might get changes in subduction style. But recent work by Adam Holt and co-authors from 2015 shows that perhaps the overriding continental lithosphere is not as passive as we seem to think. So we can see here that, for example, for the Aleutian Trench, as the thickness of the overriding plate increases, so does the steepness of the subducting slab. Work by O'Driscoll and co-authors from 2009 and 2012 also shows that the thickness of the continental lithosphere, so if we had to have a thick continental craton, can also change the dynamics of the slab at the trench. So the continent is important, but as geodynamicists, we tend to think of continental lithosphere as something which is very homogeneous, something which is thick, which is buoyant, which is strong, but nothing more than that. But if we had to look at this map by Pearsons and co-authors, we can see that this is very far from the truth. And if we had to look, for instance, at the North American plate, we can see that there is a huge variability in S-wave velocities as we go from the margins into the colder, denser, and older continental cratons. Right, so we say that there's a lot of variability, and most of our insight into continental variability comes from the surface geology. We also know what slabs look like because of seismic tomography models. And this on the right is a seismic tomography model of the Japan slab. Anything which is blue is fast S-wave, P-wave velocities. So the slab is colder, it's denser, so we have faster P-wave velocities, and anything which is red is slower than average. So we generally tend to interpret that as upwelling mantle. So seismic tomography models are very useful because they act as a CT scan, right? Very similar to the way we would have a CT scan for our body or an X-ray for our body. Seismic tomography models do the same job, but this time for the entire planet. But they only show us a snapshot of a state in time, i.e. the present. We don't know what the slab looked like in the past. We don't know what it would look like in the future. The geology, on the other hand, gives us an idea of some of the dynamics and changes that have happened through time. But how do we marry these two lines of evidence? And the answer is geodynamic models. And here is an example of a geodynamic model of a 2D subduction system going all the way from the surface to the core mantle boundary. We have an increase in viscosity at 660 kilometers depth. And we have a subducting plate and an overriding continental plate. We use the finite difference code aspect to solve for the conservation of mass, momentum, and energy. And these models are run on the fastest and largest supercomputer in the world, Frontera. We also include a power law rheology in our models, and we include plastic yielding. And things like viscosity prefactors, stress exponents, and activation energy and volumes are things which we get from lab experiments. Okay, so I forgot about this. And we also have adaptive mesh refinement, which allows us to really have really high resolution in areas of our models which really matter. So in this case, within the surface, within the continental overriding plate, we go from a kilometer to like 500 meters resolution, which is very, very, very high resolution for models of this scale. And we also refine a resolution around the subduction slab because we really want to see what is going on within our model. We do not initiate subduction in our model because we are not really interested in understanding how subduction starts. So we have a small slab, which is 200 kilometers long, and it is subducting at 70 degrees. So it's quite steep. So what do our models look like? So we can see that the slab sinks, reaches the the high viscosity lower mantle, sinks into the lower mantle and rolls back. Something interesting is happening within the continental margin in that zone here, highlighted by the red square. And this is the continental margin or the back arc region of our model. And if we had to look at this region in nature, we can see that this is a very complex region. In some places, in some subduction zones, this region tends to be in compression, shown here by red on the map. In others, this tends to be under extension, shown here by these blue markers. Work by Huret and Lallemande also suggests that the nature of the back arc region, whether it's in compression or extension, is a result of direction of the overriding plate, whether it's advancing or retreating, and the velocity at which this is doing so. They also suggest that the angle or the subduction style of the slab at the trench might have something to do with whether this region is in compression or extension. So let's explore this a little bit further and let's model a continental overriding plate in a subduction zone. And what you can see at the top is the topography at the top of our model. In the center, we have the viscosity, and then we have the strain rates. And this is for a model where we have a thick continental overriding plate, but we have no lateral heterogeneity. On the other side, we have the same exact model setup, but this time around, we've included some heterogeneity in the form of a higher viscosity continental keel. And what you can immediately see is that the slab morphology is very different and that the strain rates are also different. So in the case where we have a continental keel, we can see that there is much more and higher strain localization within this back arc region. This translates to a lower viscosity zone within our margin, which translates to this basin forming at the very top of our model. But that is just one snapshot of the model in time. What does the model look like as it evolves? And what I'm showing you here is the topography for our homogeneous continental case. On the y-axis, we have time. On the x-axis, we have distance. And at the bottom is the model evolution. And you can see that the slab will deflect at the top of the lower mantle and will eventually slowly sink, not too deep below the 660. If we look at the topography, we can see that we have a lot of uplift at the beginning, and we have the formation of these almost basin and range structures. We have basins surrounded by higher topography. Until this eventually, the signal eventually becomes erased, and we have a general sort of undulation, mostly of the continental overriding plates towards the trench. And if we look at the trench retreat, shown here in blue, we can see that this is considerable throughout the model evolution. Let's look at the heterogeneous case. And we can see that the topography is already very different all throughout the model evolution. The slab behavior is also different. This time around, the slab is actually sinking into the lower mantle after a very short anchoring period. The topography has a very well-defined basin surrounded by two shoulders of higher elevation. And the trench retreat follows a similar pattern to the case before, but this time around it is much less pronounced compared to the previous case. Okay, so continental heterogeneity matters, but does the nature of this heterogeneity have any impact on the model evolution? So to answer that question, we start off by varying the geometry of the heterogeneity. And this time around, we make our continental keel larger. And what we can see is that the topography is drastically different. We have a much wider deformation front. We have much more subsidence. And we also have the nucleation of several basins within this deformation front. If we look at the slab dynamics, we can see that we have slab flattening and an eventual avalanche of the slab into the lower mantle. Trench retreat is shown here in magenta, and it also looks quite significant. What if instead of changing the geometry now, we change the rheology and we make the continental keel denser? So the overall effect is now that the continental overriding plate is no longer positively buoyant, but it is neutrally buoyant. In this case, we can see that the slab sinks without too much difficulty into the higher viscosity lower mantle. We can see that compared to the previous models, we have significant uplift within our deformation region, and we have the formation of this really well-defined, elongated, narrow basin, surrounded by these two areas of high basin shoulders. If we had to compare the trench retreat, this is for our dense keel, with our homogeneous case, shown in blue, our standard keel and our extended continental keel, we can see that the case with the homogeneous continent has the highest amount of trench retreat, and the case with the dense keel has the least amount of trench retreat. So this tells us that not only is the presence of the continental keel important, not only heterogeneity is important, but how this heterogeneity manifests itself, what kind of heterogeneity do we have, is also important both for the slab dynamics and for the topography. So what I'm showing you here is all four models compared together. Top left is our homogeneous case, and right and bottom is our heterogeneous cases. And although you might eyeball this and quickly say, well, for the heterogeneous cases, the slab morphology looks very similar to me, you can see that the topography is very, very different. And the amount of extension and subsidence across these models is very different. So let's look now at the amount of trench retreat that we get for each model and the extent of the deformation front. So on the y-axis, we have the amount of trench retreat. On the x-axis, we have the extent, or how wide the deformation front is. And in different colors, we have different models with different keel properties. And you can see that there is a distinction between models with geometry variations and models with rheology variations. You can also see that we can broadly group these into three groups. So the first group are models with low trench retreat and a limited deformation front. And these models have very steep slabs in the upper mantle, and there isn't really much going on in terms of deformation. There isn't a lot of subsidence, there isn't a lot of uplift either. Group B models are models where the trench retreat and the amount of deformation on the overriding plate is quite significant. And these models have the characteristic temporary slab anchoring on top of the lower mantle, and the characteristic sort of horsed and graben morphology, where we have two areas of elevated terrain and a centralized basin or subsidence. And the final group is group C. These models have extensive trench retreat and huge areas of deformation. They have a lot of subsidence, and they have multiple basin nucleations, and their slabs tend to flatten and deflect on top of the lower mantle before they avalanche and sink all at once into the lower mantle. Okay, so far we've been talking about the continental keel. So this is the interior or the hinterland of our models. What about the margin? Does this have any role in changing the slab dynamics or the evolution of topography at subduction zones? And to answer that question, we start off by varying the geometry. So this is a case where we limit the size of the continental margin, and we can see that the topography at the surface is rather different. So although we still have a lot of deformation, this tends to be narrow and longer. We also change the thickness of both the continents, so both the margin and the continental keel. And we see that similar to the thin keel of before, the overriding plate deformation is very limited. Instead of this localized deformation, we just have a general trend of tilting towards the trench. What if we change the rheology of the margin? And what I'm showing you on the left is a very strong continental margin. And you can see that this time, instead of having a well-defined centralized basin, we have a bulge within our deformation region. If we make our margin weaker, instead of this bulge, we have this extended subsidence region defined mostly by two localized centers of extension, separated by this shoulder of higher elevation. So again, the geometry and the properties of the margin are also important. But how important are they for different models? So again, I'm showing you the trench retreat on the y-axis and the amount of deformation on the continent. And the different colors are different models. And over here, we can again make a difference between the geometry and the rheology. So anything that is on the left are our geometry variations models, and on the right are models where we vary the strength of the continental lithosphere. And what you can see is that there is a clear trend in increasing trench retreat and increasing deformation, the more weak we make the continent. There doesn't seem to be, and we can see this over here, there doesn't seem to be a real relationship though between our geometry cases. So although both have relatively high trench retreat, the extent, the spatial extent of their deformation front is rather limited. So why is this? What is going on here? What's happening? Let's go back and look at the keel for a moment. And what I'm showing you is the velocity for our model. So deeper, darker blues are higher velocity regions, white and lighter blues are slower velocity regions. And we're looking at this particular model. So we have a geometry variation here. And what you can see is that the velocity on the overriding plate is not equal everywhere. So you can see that the bit where we have the continental keel, the continent is hardly moving, but the margin, which is closest to the retreating slab, is moving with the retreating slab. So this tells us that we have a strong coupling between the subducting plate as it rolls back, and this is dragging the continent with it, but not the entire continent is moving together. So that part where we have the continental keel, we have a stabilizing effect. So one hand does not want to move, the other hand is being dragged. And this effect is made more pronounced or less pronounced based on the qualities or the properties of the continental keel. So what I'm showing you here is, again, the topography, the velocity and the strain rates for our keel variations and our margin variations. And you can see that this is something that happens for both types of models. And what is interesting, and the red line denotes the topography at which these model snapshots are taken. And what is interesting is if you had to look at the velocity in a little bit more detail, you realize that not only the entire continental plate is not moving together, but even within the margin, we have zones of higher velocities closer to the trench and lower velocities closer to the keel part of the margin. And this is even more pronounced when we have a weaker margin. We can see that here we actually have 4 zones of differential velocities. The other thing that is happening is that as the slab sinks into the mantle, it induces viscous flow. So it's sinking through something which is very viscous and it's inducing a return flow in the mantle wedge. The fact that we have a continental keel here is funneling this flow within a narrow zone, within a narrow nose. So you've got this flow which is going up, being funneled by the keel. And because it is high magnitude or high velocity, it is also dragging this part of the margin with it. So this is encouraging or emphasizing this effect where the margin is being essentially pulled apart. And we can see where we have this differentiation in velocity, we have localization of strain rates. And this is even more pronounced for the weaker continental plate case, where we see that we've got a lot of strain localization going on in this region. What if we look now at the geometry effects? And the first thing that you can immediately see is that there's no differentiation of velocities within the continental overriding plate. The overriding plate seems to be hardly moving, and if it is, it's moving as a coherent whole. The return flow is spatially limited, but it's also much slower compared to the previous cases. And most of the velocity is concentrated in the subducting slab. So the velocity at the subduction zone is not being partitioned. It's being held within the subducting slab, so to speak. And if we had to look at the strain rates, we can see that there is no strain localization within our overriding plate. And that is reflected in the type and amount of deformation that you see within your margin. So we've changed the margin type or the margin properties, and we've changed the continental keel properties. But what happens if we change the interface between the subducting slab and the continental overriding plate? And this is exactly what we do over here. So the first thing that we see is that we have an insane amount of trench retreat at the surface. We have considerable deformation within the margin edge, a lot of subsidence as well, which is occurring within this zone of the model. And we also notice that we have secondary subsidence within the interior of the continent, in the thickest, sort of strongest part of the continent. We can also see that we have the spontaneous development of a flat slab. And this is something quite extraordinary, because to model flat slab systems, it is really, really hard. We generally either have to force it by inducing a flat or a shallow slab angle at the trench at the start of the model, or by introducing continental plateaus, oceanic plateaus, or changes in the slab thickness at the trench. We do none of those things, and we have the development of a flat slab self-consistently. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Yeah.
What would be an example, a geological example of changing interface between the subducting slab and the margin?
So it would be, for instance, the type of sediments that you get in your trench. So if you get like thicker sediments or less consolidated sediments, or if you get higher viscosity or lower viscosity, that's going to change the interface between your subducting plate and your overriding plate, and it might make either the system more coupled or less coupled, and make subduction easier or less easy. Okay, so zooming in on what we on this new type of model, you can see the viscosity over here. You can see the pressure, where anything that is pink is low pressure, and you can see the stress, the horizontal shear stress, and anything that is red is positive compressive stress. And what you can see is that changing the interface between the subducting plate and the overriding plate not only changes the coupling between the subducting plate and the overriding plate, but it also changes what is going on within the mantle wedge. And we can see that here we have the development of a zone of low pressure. And this low pressure is essentially taking your slab and sucking it up underneath the continental overriding plate. If we look at the horizontal shear stress, we see that we have areas here in gray and here, which are under extension. But between those two areas, we have a zone of compression. And this zone of compression is occurring right here within the margin of our continental lithosphere. But there is a lot of subsidence going on. So what is really going on at different points in the model evolution? So we are looking at this time step around 95 to 95.5 million years. And what we can see is that this is the trench. So we have a very shallow trench because the slab is very close to the surface. But then at the edge of the continent, we have uplift. And this continues until within the interior of the continent, we have this secondary, this subsidence. And this is, and we can see this over here. So we have this basin formation due to compressive stresses on the overriding plate. And then we have extension within the interior, within the thickest, strongest part of the continent. And this is actually something that we observe in nature in Peru, for example, in Chile, where we observe secondary subsidence on the continental interior, which confuse people because they're like, we have a flat slab, we should have uplift, not subsidence. This makes no sense. And the other thing is, in Brazil, for example, we see a continent-wide tilting of the entire continental lithosphere. And this is why the Amazon River drains the way it does, because prior to the flat slab, the Amazon River actually drained on the other side. So this gives us some insights into flat slab formation and how important it is to think about how the plate partitions, how the plate velocities are actually being partitioned across the subduction zone. Okay, so as we have seen throughout my talk up until now, we can get very different slab behaviors based on what is going on at the surface. But what really controls the slab morphology? What are the main factors that are contributing to different slab behavior? Well, obviously the overriding plate and the overriding plate type, right? We've seen that. The slab buoyancy is also very important, and the slab strength, which means how much can the slab deform the mantle which it is sinking into. The phase transition of ringwoodite to bridgemanite and ferropericlase from the upper to the lower mantle is also very important. And the variations in the mantle viscosity structure are also very important. So we are going into the lower mantle, we are having increases in viscosity. And in this talk, we're going to be focusing mostly on the overriding plate type and the viscosity variations within the mantle. And work on slab morphologies has been done in the past. Particularly seminal work is work by Christensen in the early 90s. And these are actually, you might not think much of these, but these are actually some of the first numerical models that we have of subduction. And Christensen has shown that the amount of trench retreat that you have at the surface, but also the strength of the phase transition from ringwoodite to bridgemanite and ferropericlase, and the viscosity variations within the lower mantle can give you a whole suite of different slab behaviors. But like I said, these are quite early primitive models, right? And one obvious thing that is missing, there's no continental overriding plate. Obviously, subduction on Earth does not happen without an overriding plate. So what happens if we had to combine these models with an overriding plate? And what we have over here is we have a phase transition happening at 660 kilometers depth. And this is happening at the same depth where we have the viscosity increase in the lower mantle. And we can see that when we have an oceanic overriding plate, the slab will deflect and flatten at the very top of the lower mantle. Leaving the same model setup, the same subducting slab, but replacing the overriding plate with a continent, we now have temporary anchoring of the slab into the lower mantle. Okay, but the thing is that the viscosity structure of the Earth is something that is still very highly debated. And actually, recent work by Rudolph and co-authors from 2015 have shown that the viscosity increase does not really occur at 660 kilometers depth, but occurs at 1,000 kilometers depth. So in this case, we have the separation of the phase change, which occurs at 660, and we have the viscosity jump, which occurs further down. And you can see that for the same model setup, we have an oceanic overriding plate, the slab deflect at 660. Excellent. What if we had to change the overriding plate now? Well, we have exact same model setup, exact same slab, but changing the overriding plate forces a slab which is inclined to deflect on top of the 660 to sink into the lower mantle. Why? and let's have a look at the oceanic overriding plate. And let's look at it in stages. So this is the stage when the slab is sinking vertically downwards, reaching the 660. And we can see that the induced flow in the upper mantle has a very strong horizontal component. So this is pushing and forcing the slab to deflect and bend on top of the 660. When we have a continental overriding plate, we can immediately see that the induced viscous flow has a much stronger vertical component. And what this does is that it drags the slab down into the lower mantle. But something else is also going on. We have a thick continental overriding plate, which as it moves towards the trench, it is also dragging with it some of the topmost parts of the mantle. And this flow towards the slab forces the slab body to bend and deflect on the 660, but this is also competing with the slab tip, which is anchored and sinking downwards into the lower mantle. So you have a case where you've got these two opposing forces acting on the slab. So you can see same setup, same slab, just changing the overriding plate gives us a very different behavior in the upper mantle and very different slab morphology. So to understand this a little bit better, we have come up with a ratio. Geodynamicists love the ratios. And this ratio is called SB, and it is essentially the deep slab angle found at the slab tip divided by the shallow slab angle, which is found close to the trench. So this will give us a measure of how the slab is behaving and evolving in the mantle. And when the slab is in its juvenile stage, SB is bigger than 1. We have a very steep curved slab. We have an insane amount of penetration in the upper mantle. We have a lot of fast slab rollback. When the slab matures and SB now is equal to 1, we can see that we have had a lot of work to take the steep curved slab to something which is now straight. There is a lot of intra-slab deformation going on here, but very little in terms of penetration. As the slab reaches its old age, SB is now smaller than 1. We have very little, if any, slab penetration into the lower mantle. Instead, we see this flattened slab tip morphology, and subduction is actually accommodated by the slab traveling laterally on top of the 660. However, when we have a continental overriding plate, after the old age, we have a rejuvenation stage. And SB now again increases and is bigger than 1. We have a steep slab tip, which is below 660 kilometers depth and is pulling and dragging the slab into the lower mantle. This renews the penetration into the lower mantle. However, it has to compete with the flattened slab morphology due to the continental effects above 660 kilometers depth. And we can see all of these slab morphologies in seismic tomography. And what I'm showing you here is actually a cross-section of a P-wave model by Foucault and co-authors, where, again, as a reminder, anything that is blue is fast, cold, and therefore slabs. Anything that is red is slow, warm, i.e. upwelling. And what you can see is that we have slab material from the surface all the way to the core mantle boundary. We have lots of different morphologies. We have flattened slabs. For instance, here we have the Japan slab, which is flattened at 660 kilometers depth. But we also have these very strange blobs, which are not connected or seemingly do not have no obvious relationship or no obvious connection to the surface or to any ongoing subduction today. So we talked about flattened slabs, we talked about penetrating slabs, but where do these blobs fit in? And the current interpretation is that each individual blob represents a particular episode of subduction. So the tip of the slab fragment represents the initiation of that subduction regime. And the top part of the slab, excuse me, and the top part of the slab represents the cessation of that subduction regime. So the point where the slab broke off close to the surface and subduction stopped. Any material above the slab fragment represents a reorganization and a reshuffling of the plates at the surface and the restart of a new subduction system, and so on and so forth. And this is a very useful interpretation because we can date the initiation of subduction, we can date the cessation of subduction. If we measure the length of the slab, we can also have an idea of how long this subduction was active for. So excellent. We can also take that slab fragment and reconstruct the presence of the paleo trench. And the way to do that is to take that slab fragment and move it vertically upwards through the mantle up until at some point it hits the surface. And ta-da, we have our trench. Excellent. Fantastic. And this has actually been used for a lot of plate reconstruction models, including this one by Van der Meer and co-authors from 2009. So using this method, they have decided where the paleo trenches used to be located. They have inferred the location of the paleo continents, and they have calculated how the continents have moved through time. So this seems very useful, and it is, except that it comes with a number of assumptions. The first assumption is that trenches are stationary. Now, if you had to look at any geological evidence, or if you wanted to look at any numerical models or analog models, you'd see that trenches do not stay stable. They move about. Generally, they retreat. The other assumption is that all slab fragments must have broken close to the surface. If we have shallow slab breakoff, we remove the buoyancy effect, which is dragging the slab downwards, which means that subduction has to stop. The other assumption is that subduction is vertical. So subduction sinks, the slab sinks in a direct line underneath the trench, not unlike, you know, when you get toothpaste and you press it and it forms that like squiggly thing, a similar approach. But again, if we had to look at seismic tomography and if we had to look at our models, we can see that generally the slab body tends to be hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers laterally removed from the trench at the surface. So these assumptions are a little bit problematic, which then leads us on to ask, is this the only way that we have to explain these slab fragments? And I say to you, what if we could break slabs in another way? What if slabs didn't have to break close to the surface? What if they broke at the top of the lower mantle? And this is an entirely new concept. Geodynamicists and subduction people did not think that this was possible, because what is the driving mechanisms? How do you get a slab to sink into the lower mantle and then suddenly, wham, break in two? So let's try and understand what's going on here. The model is correct, by the way. So let's try and understand the physics of what is going on here. So at the beginning, we have a slab that is sinking into the lower mantle. And you can see it is a coherent, consistent slab. It reaches 660, everything is fine. And then it reaches the top of the lower mantle. And you can see that the slab is still coherent, it is still whole. But something interesting is happening here. Eventually, the slab splits into a separate parent and an abandoned orphan. So let's look at this time step, and let's look at the density. So what I'm showing here is the density of our model, and you can see that at 660 kilometers depth, there is a lens of lower density. And this lens of lower density exists because, as you know, as the slab sinks from the surface all the way down into the mantle, it goes different phase transitions. So olivine changes phases to a higher pressure and temperature phases. And one phase change that occurs at 660 is Wesleyite changes to bridgmanite and ferropericlase. Bridgmanite and ferropericlase are higher density phases of Wesleyite or of olivine. But this change is very temperature dependent. So I need my material to be at the right temperature for it to change. And the surrounding material in the mantle is at the right temperature, so it has changed into this higher density phase. But within the slab core, things are very, very, very cold. So we have not yet reached the temperature to change our Wesleyite to bridgemanite and ferropericlase. So what we have is within the cold slab core, we have a lens of untransformed buoyant material that says, I don't want to sink. I am not sinking. So this creates compressions up dip within the slab. But some of the slab material has sank and has transformed. So it's higher density, so it is heavier. So this is creating tension on the slab body down dip, right? So let me explain this to you in a more sort of visual way. So if, for instance, Paul had to take my arm and pull my palm, and I am resisting his pull through my forearm, and my arm could behave plastically, what we would see is that eventually my arm would split, would stretch and shear and split at my wrist. And Paul would end up with my palm, and I would end up with the rest of my arm. And this is exactly what's happening to the slab. There is another ingredient here, apart from this deformation and the shearing, and that is the induced viscous flow around the slab. So this flow is vertical at the beginning and is helping to drag the slab downwards. However, during orphaning, we can see that we have two different senses of flow. So in the upper mantle, flow is going towards the right, and at the top of the lower mantle, flow is going towards the left. So you've got this deforming, this yielding slab, the shearing slab, and on top of that, it's also being pushed into different directions. So that's going to encourage the slab to eventually split into a parent and a little orphan. And the parent slab will continue to travel on top of the 660, will now take on a flattened morphology, and the little slablet will continue sinking under Stokes velocity towards the core mantle boundary. So the question is, what are the conditions for orphaning? Do we find orphaning everywhere, or is it a one-off case? And what I'm showing you here is a regime diagram with the slab strength on the y-axis. So think of this as a proxy for slab strength. And on the x-axis, this is the Clapeyron slope of the phase transition. So think of this in terms of resistance to subduction. And in red diamonds, we have slabs which tend to flatten at 660 kilometers depth. And in these magenta triangles, we have slabs which penetrate into the lower mantle. And these are the two end members that we see in geodynamic models, that we see in seismic tomography. And one of the biggest questions in the field is, are these two things related? And if so, how? And the answer is orphaning. Orphaning lies in between these two end members and connects them. So a slab which has orphaned is one which was initially penetrating, it underwent orphaning, and became a flattened slab morphology. And orphaning occurs for very strong slabs, for very weak slabs, and also for medium strong slabs. And this is not just a thought exercise. We think that we can see slab orphaning at Japan. So here you have the parent slab and the little slablet, which is being orphaned, and at the Tonga, again, flattened parent and abandoned orphan. And with that, I hope that I have made you think about the relationship between the deep earth processes and the surface deformation. The two are linked together, they feed into each other, and we cannot understand at all how surface deformation occurs without understanding deep earth processes. Deep earth processes are also important for our understanding of how the planet have evolved. When we are trying to understand paleocontinent movements, when we're trying to understand the breakup of continents and tectonic surface regime changes, we need to think about what are the actual processes that are driving them at depth. The other thing is that this continental lithosphere dichotomy has an important, a huge role in how plate velocities are actually distributed across the subduction zone. And this has consequences for the behavior of our slab, but also for the evolution of topography. And finally, this continental heterogeneity can explain why do we have intramontane basins in places like Peru, for example, or why we have these extended back arcs like the Aegean and northern Japan, and why we see such a huge diversity of slab behaviors underneath the same continent, underneath the same type of overriding plate. And with that, I thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, please shoot them my way.
Question from your audience.
Are you saying that you can't get slab flattening without flattening?
So the question is, can you get slab flattening without orphaning? And the answer is yes. It is an interplay. So the slab behavior, whether you get slab flattening or orphaning, is mostly an interplay between the strength of the slab and the strength of the mantle at the top of the lower mantle. So some slabs will not orphan at all; they will just flatten. But most of the slab behavior we have seen will, especially if the slab is initially penetrating, will go through orphaning and then flatten.
That's the follow-up. That case itself, I understand what you talked about with respect to differences in the continental composition and the resulting topography. So what is the implication of the orphaning process for either the continents or the natural chemistry or what?
So this is something that so the question was, what is the implication of orphaning for the surface processes, right? And it's something that I skimmed over really quickly. So when we have orphaning, subduction continues. Subduction doesn't stop, doesn't terminate. Whereas previous interpretations, every time there was a fragment slab, we're like, okay, subduction must have stopped. We must have had an overhaul of the entire surface. Things were moving in one direction, then they had to move in another completely direction. And people have gone to extremely complicated and painful lengths to try and explain how suddenly like things were going one way, and then all of a sudden things started going in a completely different direction. So it means that we did not, when we have orphaning, we do not have to stop and start a subduction. Subduction is more continuous. And although obviously there have been shifts in tectonic regimes at the surface, they are not as common, or they may not be as common as we seem to think. They're not like a constant thing which is happening as a surface every so often.
There's a question from the online audience, and then Amanda. So Lydia is asking, what happens to the orphan in the deep mantle? How long is it likely to last in the deep mantle before it's completely mixed, absorbed?
So that is an excellent question. And the answer is, it depends on the size of the orphan and the temperature, how old or how cold the slab orphan is. But generally it will sink essentially under Stokes blob velocity. So under its own weight, it will just sink until it reaches the core mantle boundary. The rate at which it sinks also depends on the mantle viscosity, but eventually it will make it to the core mantle boundary. Assimilation rates kind of vary. There isn't one consensus. There isn't a consensus on necessarily the assimilation rates of the slabs within the mantle, but maybe around 250 million years.
I hope that answers the question online. Amanda?
I actually have a very, very similar question, but I'll lead on from that. So in the rock record, we're studying sedimentology. There's certain areas of the world like Colorado Plateau that seem to be sort of paleo drainage, like continental wide drainages. So that happened kind of just after, in and around the Triassic, coming through into the kind of Sevier foreland basin, receiving this huge continental scale. So what you would find is that we should maybe consider whether we've got this orphaning happening at that point, that then is possibly driving these changes.
So
and can we find the orphan? I suppose that's leading on from work, like if we suspect that's the case in the rock record, how far back can we try and then look for that open through seismic topography?
So I'll start with the last question, because actually under the margin of northwestern US, we have huge amounts of isolated slab walls related to the foreland subduction.
Yeah.
And it's actually we have a paper currently in review suggesting that those foreland fragments are related to slab orphaning. Obviously, not all of them, because there is some records, some evidence from the geological record that we did have, subduction reversal and jumps in the trench. But the current interpretation is that every single of these huge slab walls must be the result of shallow slab breakoff, implies that we needed insane amounts of oceanic crust, entire oceanic basins to be subducted really, really quickly, because otherwise you cannot really get the slab down there. Whereas if the slab is already down there and it breaks, then that kind of makes things a little bit easier. In terms of the reversal of drainage, that was more about the subduction style. So changing the style of the subduction close to the trench from something which is steeply dipping at very shallow depths to a flat slab induces this basin formation, which is counterintuitive, because you think if I have a slab underneath a continent and I am pushing it upwards, you have mountains. But you actually create these localized regions of subsidence and depositions and basin formation, even further inland from where the flat slab is. And it creates this tilting of the margin from towards the trench, which is something which generally happens at most subduction zones, because you've got this coupling with the subducting plate and the overriding plate is being dragged into the trench. When you have a flat slab, this essentially overriding plate tilts towards the other direction, and that is essentially what happened for the Amazon, right?
Yeah, I think mine was much related to the forelands. You mentioned that, because that's where there's a lot of record-based work. We've never been able to get an answer from tectonic pointing people as to, like, we have these huge river systems, 700 kilometers in size, and there's not mountain ranges. Well, there has to be. It's a huge scale, and we're talking lowland river system, not talking Amazon degradation.
Right.
This is their basin. So yeah, be interested to hear what's happened to the foreland, because it's exactly at that point. Everyone sees the westward kind of mountain chain, but there's huge sediments coming in from the south as well, but they never really explain what's going on with that. So
that is really fascinating. I never actually thought to kind of look beyond, like surface deformation into more like what is happening to what the rivers are doing. Where are they going? Where are they taking the deposits?
yeah, it's just that we've got evidence that they're going from south to north. It's fictional mountain range that they must be coming from, but they'll be coming from somewhere. And yeah, so yeah, it's the 70s when kind of talking really into late Jurassic Cretaceous, whereas this is mid-Jurassic into late Jurassic.
We should definitely have a longer chat about that. That is really cool.
There's another question from the online audience, from Bailey. They're saying, amazing talk. Thank you, Antoniette. What kind of conditions make slab orphaning more likely?
So slab orphaning can really occur at all different sorts of slab strengths. But what you need for slab orphaning is the presence of a low viscosity layer and a separation between the viscosity increase of the mantle at 1,000 kilometers depth and the phase transition. So if the phase transition and the viscosity jump of the lower mantle occur at the same time, we do not have orphaning because there's just too much resistance, right? Like the slab cannot penetrate into the lower mantle. There isn't this, remember how I was saying, like Paul is pulling my hand and I am like resisting it? Like there's no Paul pulling my hand. So we really need to have this split.
Any more questions?
On the other side, if you've got a slab that has been form happens, how the production has moved on, and when the demand for it. Has there been any work done on how that will impact some scale when it comes to all this potentially explain that if it doesn't take you
No, and I would really love to, you know, actually look at that. Yes. Yes, that is a very interesting question. And yeah, one thing that, for instance, I'm really curious about is once you get this, for instance, at this stage, right, when you have this split, can you get upwelling from underneath the orphan, from above the orphan and underneath the parent, and when it makes it to the surface, then do you get any, is the plume signature different because it had to cross across these kind of slab gates before it made it to the surface? I don't know.
the other end, and I don't know.
Excellent. So maybe we can talk about all the things that we don't know and come up with a new idea.
Another, I guess, last question from the online audience. Incredible, they're very active. So, question by Christina. Fantastic talk, Antoniette. When we used to go to southern Spain with the students, the idea was that Sierra Nevada is formed by slab morphology. Would you agree?
Possibly. I have not looked at southern Spain, so I am not sure. I need to look at seismic tomography and look at the tectonic setting. Currently, I haven't, so I am not sure. Possibly, but I'm not sure.
Christina says we need to talk.
Yes, I would love to talk. Please talk to me.
Another comment from Luke, because he's in Sydney. Good day from Sydney, fantastic talk. It's too late here for me to come up with coherent questions, but fantastic stuff.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Luke, for joining us, and Lydia as well, from joining us from Australia. So thank you very much.
That's a pretty good question. You can transform faults between, you know, how it shows the beginning parts of the slab that were shallow on the western boundary of South America, and then that's in the middle that's
So
share this sections that were relatively flat or connected by a section that were dipping.
I'm not sure.
It's like one of the first slides. I just wondered if you did, you know, kind of like a mid-ocean ridges where you've got much transform faults between sections. That's the opposite geological sort of extension. But if we did transform faults between those parts of the slab that are dipping at different angles. Sorry, maybe this isn't good. We talk about it.
So do you mean if we get transform faults within the slab body? Is that your question?
Yes. Yes.
So as the slab is changing its orientation from like steeply dipping to shallow dipping, do we get transform faults? Is that the question?
Maybe after doing the slide.
So here, no.
Something like an example of a place where you have two segments that are shallow or flatter connected by a segment that's deeper.
I'm not sure. Oh, here. This one.
Yeah, that's
so
connecting those, bounding those regions, like extensional machines who have the transform faults bounding different bits.
So that is an excellent question, and one which I would love to explore. The answer is I don't know, because my models are 2D. You need a 3D model for that. And the amount of computational resources that you need to run this kind of model in 3D are insane.
I guess they were unexpected. So I think that these are some kind of perpendicular.
So there are these moment tensor studies which are done across slabs and give you an idea essentially of whether you have compression or extension within the slab. And you can see essentially what kind of deformation mechanism you have, right? Whether it's brittle or ductile and things like that. But the problem is it's not necessarily easy to identify what exactly is the cause of that behavior. Is it because you've got a transform fault, or is it because the slab is essentially cracking, or is it because you've got like changes in deformation regime? The answer is we don't know. It would be really useful to look at these kind of things in 3D and see what geometry variations actually give you and how you get this interaction across the trench. And it's actually one of the things I really want to do if you just need computational resources.
Right, I guess we finish up, and thanks for coming, and welcome for next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is this recorded?
Yeah.
Because I'll leave so nothing happens on this. So you know.
One quick question, John.
Just
Do I
end the
stop?
meeting. Meeting from